She's like a broken pot that's not afraid of shattering, and I'm a dead pig who no longer minds that the water's coming to a boil. Hey everyone, it's Seamus from A Novel Review, the book podcast series. If you are a lover of books, you are in the right place because every week I review a different book, and this week is of course going to be no different. Today I am kicking off, it's the first week of August, which means we're going to a new country, which is incredibly exciting. And if you don't know what that means, if you're a first-time listener of the show, every month for 2025 I am trying to go to, or I'm going to go to, a different country through books. It's my book world tour. I'll read 2 books from that respective country. The rules are simple: male and female author when possible, and of course the author has to be born in that country and writing about that country. So today I'm kicking off August. I was about to say July. We're kicking off August. I can't believe we're in August already. The Chronicle of a Blood Merchant by Yu Hua from China. Apologies if I'm absolutely butchering the name there. I'm holding the cover up for the benefit of those on YouTube. I hope you appreciate the matching of the color for the cover of the book to the shirt I am wearing. That was not coordinated, but a happy surprise nonetheless. So as I said, if you're a lover of books, please do like and subscribe, come along for the journey. Please feel free to offer recommendations, but please be aware that, I sometimes get lots of recommendations. If I get 10 recommendations at 10 books, that's 10 weeks, and that's got to fit into the regular schedule as well. So if you do recommend a book, I will do my very best to get to it, but it might take some time. That does not mean that I do not absolutely appreciate every recommendation that is tossed my way. I really do appreciate it, and I have a big list on my phone where every book that I am recommended on the podcast does get put in my notes on my phone. And so when I'm in a bookshop feeling a bit mindless, uncertain what I'm looking for and searching or wanting a little bit of direction, I should say, I can just turn to the list of you guys have given me. So I really do appreciate that. So yeah, like and subscribe, come along for the journey. And yeah, I think it's time to stop yapping and time to start chatting about the book. Okay, on with the story. Chronicle of a Blood Merchant, Yu Hua. Fantastic little story. Really took me by surprise. Really quite charming in the end. It definitely sweeps through a lot of very large issues, which I'll get into, of course. But quite a nice story in the end. I really quite enjoyed it. I think first things first, the book is a translated edition by Andrew F. Jones, translated into English. Just again, holding it up for the benefit of those on YouTube so you can see. Yeah, translated from English from Chinese by Andrew F. Jones. I believe it was translated for the first time in around 2003, so relatively recently. It was written in the 90s. Yu Hua himself did live during the Cultural Revolution of Maoist China. I was reading an article about Maoist China because I don't know that much about China, and I don't think I've ever read a Chinese book until I read this one, of course. I don't think I've ever read a Chinese book, and if I have, nothing's coming front of mind right at this very moment. So I did a little bit of research, read an article, and someone was basically saying that after the Cultural Revolution of Maoist China, more or less every book written about China touches upon it or kind of has it threaded in their story somehow, and it's really hard even now to escape the feeling and the sentiment that was felt through that time. So really interesting that Yu Hua lived through that time, because you definitely see elements of it. It's definitely a plot point through the story, and obviously not nice that it happened, of course, but it is nice that we do get, I guess, that authentic feeling about what it was actually like, because it's incredibly important to remember those kind of feelings so that hopefully something like this doesn't happen again. So I think we should do a very brief overview of the story. It is more or less about a character called Sanguan, or Zhu Sanguan, and he is a silk merchant living in a town in China, more or less going about his business. It is not quite a cradle-to-grave story in that it doesn't start with his birth and end with his death, but it does start when he's sort of late teens, early 20s, and the story does end when he is much, much older. He's married and he's got 3 grown-up children by the end of it, so yeah, much, much older. So it covers a very large portion of his life, and it's more or less about the trials and tribulations that he faces throughout the course of his life. He's obviously faces a lot of personal issues and interrelationship issues. So yeah, issues sort of directly that he is, I guess, responsible for and part of, in that it's, a relationship issue or a family issue. And then, of course, there's the external issues of like Maoist China coming to rise that he then has to navigate as well. So these kind of external issues that then start to affect his day-to-day life. He does donate blood occasionally through the course of the story. It was an interesting plot point, which I thought made for a really nice story in the end. At this particular point in time, donating blood in China, and this still might be the case because I don't quite know, is seen as a very taboo thing to do. You do get paid, it seems to be a solid amount of money for donating blood, for donating what seems to be about 500 mils of blood. Yeah, you seem to get paid a very decent amount, and it is quite a taboo thing to do. And I think that's because they view it as more or less giving up part of the thing that gives you life, giving up your blood, of course. That's the thing that courses through your veins, that keeps your heart pumping, that your heart pumps through your body. So it is like an incredibly personal thing to do. And because of this, Sanguan doesn't do it that often. He kind of does it once and realizes that this money is quite sacred, and he wants to spend it on something that's incredibly important and personal to him, which I think is quite nice because I don't quite know. He seems to struggle with money a lot throughout the story, but he never then thinks, okay, well, let's just go to donate blood and earn money sort of as often as possible. It doesn't become something he does every 3 months when the blood is fully replenished. It's something he only seems to do when he's really desperate for money, and it becomes this really nice thing because then it's kind of that nature of self-sacrifice and what he's prepared to do for these different points in his life, and it becomes like a really nice aspect to the story. And yeah, that's more or less what the story is about. It's quite a simple story. It's presented as this grand, epic, sort of sweeping, I guess, family drama, like I said, nearly cradle to grave. But what it ends up being is this really simple but evocative tale of just a man and his family and all the issues they face along the way. So something I really love about cradle to grave stories or these stories that are quite sweeping is just how much they shift and change throughout the course of the story themselves. The first half of this story, I think, does have this real comedic edge. The whole story has this comedic edge to it, this very dark comedy edge to it. But I think the first half, it reads, I'm going to say a bit more lighthearted, even though it's not lighthearted what's going on at all. They are dealing with some pretty dark themes, but I think the themes that are dark are brought on by themselves, which kind of gives it that extra edge of comedy. At least I think, because it's things that they've sort of brought upon themselves as a family, which makes it a bit more, I think, lighthearted and easy to engage with the characters in a certain way. And then in the second half, it completely shifts because that's when the Cultural Revolution starts to happen. So different things start to happen that they have no control over. And that's when it becomes definitely a lot darker of a story. But this first half I just found really comedic and really interesting because you get the sense that they're living in this pretty conservative and traditional society, and yet the characters just feel incredibly large and readers incredibly large and really leap off the page, and they're just absolutely outrageous. I wouldn't say they're quite caricatures or anything like that, in that they're not that outrageous, but they are pretty outrageous in what they get up to, and just sort of the way they carry themselves through the first half of the story is just kind of these really larger than life characters, even though it does feel like it's this relatively conservative story. And I really like that because it makes them a bit more humorous, and you're able to sort of laugh at them and laugh with them at the same time, despite the fact that they're dealing with some pretty dark themes. And I think what that does is having this little element of humor to what's going on humanizes the characters a lot more, and so gives you, I think, that extra added sympathy towards the characters. You don't start to, at least I didn't start to hate any particular character for what they were doing. I just kind of read it as, yeah, they're just sort of going through the, I don't want to say natural trials and tribulations of what happens over the course of a life, because some of the stuff that happens, I don't want anyone to ever have to go through in the course of their life. But it's this idea of like, things are going to go wrong sometimes in your life, and sometimes you're going to have control over them, and sometimes you're not, and sometimes you're just going to be throwing your hands in the air, as his wife often does. Lan often, when something happens, throws her hands in the air and says, "Why me?" And it's kind of like these moments of outrageous repetition. She's constantly just going, "Why me? Why me? What did I do to deserve this life?" And often she's quite valid in what she's saying and how she's saying it and the things that she's complaining about, but it's kind of like this use of repetition and this use of dark humor that really humanizes everyone within the story, that makes it quite, I don't want to say comforting, because again, they're dealing with some pretty hectic themes, but comforting in that, like, you know that they're more or less sticking together. You don't think they're going to break up. And even though, for better or worse, they probably should break up in the early stages of their relationship, they do stick together. And that kind of makes it quite nice in a way if they weren't absolutely being absolutely outrageously terrible people to each other. But it just adds that kind of like outrageous cruelty kind of mixed with kindness through this story that I found, yeah, really quite enjoyable, especially in the first half. So one of the chief tensions of this story is Sanguan and Yulan grow up, they get married, and they have 3 children, and the oldest child is called Yael. And it comes out that when Yael is 11 years old, Yael is actually not the child of Sanguan. He is the child of Yulan and her former boyfriend, but kind of grey areas to what was actually going on with another guy called Zhao Yong. And it becomes this really, I guess, gut-wrenching story. And this is what I mean, like there's dark elements and there's dark comedic elements, but there's some really nice touching elements through the story as well. Sort of, it becomes a story for Yael and then of course for Sanguan as well as to what is a father, what is a parent. You know, Yael obviously struggles a lot through the story for searching for a paternal figure and wrestling with the fact that he's kind of in this family that doesn't necessarily always accept him as their son, or at least Sanguan doesn't always accept him as his son. And it's kind of like wrestling and searching for that paternal figure in his life that is actually solid and that he can rely on, because his actual father, Zhao Yong, doesn't really want anything to do with him and doesn't recognize him as his son. So he kind of like really struggles for a lot of the course of the story. And Sanguan does a lot of things that I think are, you know, completely unfair. And it's kind of this really back and forth story, because it's unfair what he does in that he takes a lot out on Yael, and he doesn't take it out on other people, and he doesn't really manage his emotions in a way that I think is healthy, because he does take a lot of his frustration out on Yael when Yael is more or less innocent in the situation. But it does sort of all sort of come around and feed back into this really nice story of like the trials and tribulations of the dramas that families are going to, I guess, naturally suffer through the course of the life. And it becomes this tale, or at least one aspect of it becomes this tale as to, you know, what actually defines a family, what makes you a family. Is it, of course, the blood that you know courses through your children's vein? And this is where the donation of blood comes into it, the fact that he's a blood donor because he's giving his blood for other people, and it plays a large part to the back end of the story. But it becomes this story as to, you know, what actually classifies a family, what defines a family. You know, you've raised this child for 11 years now. Does that mean he's more or less your son just because he came from someone else? I mean, of course, you're naturally going to feel cheated, and Sanguan does say many, many times that he feels like a cuckold. He's been cuckolded for 11 years, he says, and he's had to pay for this child that isn't his own. But it becomes this really, I guess, touching story and exploration about what actually is a family and what defines a family and what are the responsibilities you have to family, even if they're not your direct family. So yeah, really beautiful story in the end in that kind of thing. But then, of course, intermingled with these sort of family issues and moments, and of course the dark comedy, are then the very real issues that come, especially in the second half of the story, which is the Cultural Revolution. And the story, you know, completely shifts tone. And even though we've had sort of a relatively easygoing story for the first 150 pages, it just completely shifts. And that obviously feels very realistic, because something like this, something like Mao's China, did shift relatively quickly when the face of China did radically change, and a lot of things happened very, very quickly and changed the face of China. And so there's famine in the story, and it's all about the family struggling. And Yulan is paraded through the streets and sort of publicly shamed for being a prostitute, even though she's not a prostitute. But it becomes this really frightening story of like understanding you have your own issues over here, your family issues on one side that you actively probably contribute to and are responsible for in some sense. And then on this other side, you just have these external forces that can completely change the shape of what your family is. And it's this really difficult aspect of time, especially when there's the famine going on and they're quite literally starving. And then of course there's the period where Yulan's being treated incredibly poorly as this prostitute. And even though these are incredibly dark times, these external forces you see have this really strong impact upon the family and actually strengthen the family bond. Through the course of these actions, you know, you kind of realize in these moments that these external forces are sort of beating upon us like wave upon rock, and we've got to come together and band together and be one, be this really strong family unit to survive this, and that's how you're going to do it. And so it's really like this nice cradle to grave story, more or less cradle to grave story about the the nature of family and how important it is. And, family takes many different forms. It's, maybe not a traditional family in that sense because Sanguan believes he's been cuckolded, but does that mean that this son is any less important to him? I don't know. You will have to read the story to find out. I mean, I really enjoyed it. Cradle to Grave stories are a personal favorite of mine. I do love the idea of a cradle to grave story and sort of spending a book with one person's life and seeing how they progress through time, seeing how they change and develop and react to different things, and you can sort of understand their life in a bit more context than you would in other stories. Cradle to Grave stories are often quite big books. This is quite small, just 260-ish pages, which is quite nice because it feels incredibly large. It feels incredibly expansive. I think it explores a lot, but it never feels rushed. It never feels overwritten. I think the translation does a very fair job. I didn't think there were any moments where I was reading words and thinking, oh, that feels a bit sticky and maybe that hasn't been translated, absolutely beautifully and doesn't capture the beauty of the language that it would be if I were reading it in the traditional Chinese. So I think it was a fantastic novel. Absolutely great novel to start my China reading experience. Great novel to read for the podcast. Chronicle of a Blood Merchant, Yu Hua. I really enjoyed it. I'm probably going to give this a 3.7 out of 5, I think. And I think that's pretty fair. Okay, so what am I reading this week? As always, I am now reading the second Chinese book, Naked Earth by Eileen Chang. Again, I'll hold it up for the benefit of those on YouTube watching the episode. Great book so far. I'm going to say I'm very glad that I read Chronicle of a Blood Merchant first because I think it was a great introductory to the Chinese culture. The dark humor, I thought, gives it that lighter element, whereas this story is just straight dark. It's a different shift. It's dealing with more or less similar themes, Maoist China, the Cultural Revolution, but there is so far no humor in this book at all. It is just straight up bleak. That's not to say it's bad at all. I'm really loving it, and I of course love the fact that it feels completely different to Chronicle of a Blood Merchant. I know at the end of Naked Earth episode I will be comparing the pair and seeing if I can find similarities. But I am enjoying the change of pace and tone and getting this really sort of dark and gritty story about what's actually going on. Because, nice to balance things up, of course. So, I'm 70 pages in, 300 in total. Great book so far, really enjoying it. So, make sure you tune in for that. Okay, well, here we are at the end of the episode. Thanks so much for tuning in all the way. I really do appreciate it. I always finish the episode with a quote. And today, I actually don't have a quote. I've got the two titles also by Yu Hua, and I actually read them as a quote because I think they go quite nicely together as a quote. So these are the two books, To Live and The Past and the Punishments. But I think if you put them together, it actually sounds kind of nice. So here we go. To Live, The Past and the Punishments.